Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Iott. I'm going to kick us off. Thank you, first of all, to April, Colleen, and Aaron for inviting us to talk today about this report because we, of course, find it very interesting and fascinating, and we're happy to share our work with you all. So Heather and Mike and I are going to go ahead and share the results, and then we're happy to take any questions and have a discussion about this afterward. So sorry, I have to find my advanced. So yes, we're talking about our report that we just issued in January of this year. But I should probably say, first of all, who we are in case you don't know who GAO is. But GAO is a nonpartisan, objective government research agency for Congress. We work for Congress, and we answer questions asked by chair people and or written into law. We provide reports that are fact-based and objective and nonpartisan on the information that we research and study. And so that's who we are and why we're here, why we did this report and why we're talking to you. What else are we going to talk about today? We're going to talk to you about EPA's 1994 CSO control policy that we studied in this report. We're going to give you a little bit of our findings. We identified 3 challenges for municipalities in managing CSOs, and we're going to talk to you about the recommendations that we made to EPA and give you some thoughts about what to do next, and then talk about questions and answers. So I mentioned a little bit about who we are, that we work for Congress, and that's why we're here talking today about this topic. We were asked to do this work, just a little bit of background about why Congress was interested in it, why they asked us to do the work. We were asked by key California delegation members to look at combined sewer overflows, and in particular, they were interested because San Francisco was an early adopter of controls and trying to manage its combined sewer overflows. And they were interested in what progress San Francisco had made. And in fact, there was some ongoing litigation about San Francisco's overflows and permits and related things. And there's actually been some action on that just this week that we can update you on a little bit later in our discussion. So we met with the delegation, we talked to them. We wanted to look nationwide at this topic because we have not looked at it for quite a while. And we do try to inform Congress on national level issues and national policies. So this is, of course, an important Clean Water Act problem. And controlling combined sewer overflows has been a concern of EPA's for quite a while. So we wanted to do an update on how EPA was doing and carrying out this policy and working with states and municipalities to carry it out. So that's why we ended up doing this work. We issued the report in January. I just mentioned that. This is the cover of it. We can pop the information about the report and the link to it. I think it's on the last page of our presentation. So just in case anybody wants to know or doesn't know what a combined sewer overflow is or a combined sewer system, we have a nice graphic here. A combined sewer system uses one pipe to transfer both sewage, sanitary sewer, and stormwater discharges in one pipe system to a wastewater treatment plant before it's treated and then discharged into a nearby water body, either a lake or a river or a stream. And we have a diagram here of a dry weather and wet weather situation. During dry weather, things just work normally. Everything goes to the wastewater treatment plant, gets treated and discharged, no problem. During heavy rain, snow melt, that kind of thing, there can be too much water, stormwater combined with the sewage for the pipes to control and contain, and to avoid damage to the system. That raw sewage and combined stormwater can be discharged, overflow discharge. And so there are overflows designed into the system that allow the discharge of that polluted water away from the wastewater system to prevent damage. So it causes the discharge of raw sewage into water bodies, which is a problem because of pathogens, bacteria, you know, any contact with those kinds of things cause health issues like rashes and breathing difficulties, other things. So it's not a desirable situation. And so EPA has worked to try to control that since 1989 and since 1994 officially, and the policy that we'll tell you about in a moment. So I think that's all about the discharges. The 3 questions that we're going to talk to you about and give you some information about today and that we covered in our report. What is EPA's policy? What does it entail to address combined sewer overflows? What is the status of municipalities' efforts to address CSOs? Oh, and I should have mentioned, there are, oh, I think I have another graphic. I'll wait for a moment. What is the status of municipalities' efforts to address CSOs? And what challenges are they facing dealing with their combined sewer overflows? And then how is EPA doing tracking progress on all of these efforts? And here's my map. Okay, here's kind of where all these CSOs are located, largely in the Great Lakes area. Most of them are up here. This gets back to early development of the country, and this is a system that was used in early development of the country. So it's in the Northeast, Great Lakes, and there's some in the Northwest too. And so there are in total about 700 communities, 700 plus communities that are dealing with this across the country, the most in the Great Lakes region in the Northeast. So that's just a quick kind of locational map for where they are. And now I'm going to hand it over to Mike to give some more background about the policy, water quality standards, and that sort of thing.
All right, thanks, Susan. And just to follow up on the last graphic, what you'll see in some of the slides you see here are examples from 11 of the municipalities that we focused on through the report. So those will be a lot of the references to our findings throughout. I'm going to start with just a general overview of sort of the regulation of CSOs under the Clean Water Act, just as a basis for a lot of the terms you'll hear later, and just things you're probably familiar with, but some of the issues that come up with CSOs through our work and that you'll hear about. So the first is that under the Clean Water Act, a permit is required for any discharge of pollutants from a point source into navigable waters of the U.S. These permits are issued through the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES. So CSO discharges, they occur through designated outfalls throughout a wastewater collection system, and they are considered point sources. So a utility will need to have an NPDES permit to authorize those discharges. EPA can issue NPDES permits, and it may also authorize states, tribes, and territorial governments to implement and enforce all or part of an NPDES program, including developing and issue permits. In our review, we had a mix of those authorities. We had a utility in Springfield, Massachusetts, where EPA is the direct permit issuer. And then we had San Francisco, where EPA and the state jointly issue a permit. And then the remaining 9 municipalities were all state issued permits. So in issuing an NPDES permit, regulatory authorities set limits, terms and conditions to establish limits on pollutants in the discharges, as well as criteria for meeting water quality standards for the receiving waters. With respect to CSOs, most permits do not include specific limits on pollutants in those discharges, but may generally have more general limits, such as the frequency, volume, and duration of events. They'll also have conditions that you may require that they remove solids and floatables from the discharges, usually by putting screens on the outfalls just to collect those materials, and also requirements to maintain their equipment in the collection system so that it operates efficiently and gets the flows to the wastewater treatment plant so that CSO discharges and their occurrences are minimized. In some areas, such as the Great Lakes, they do require secondary treatment where they'll use biological processes and microbes to reduce and remove organic materials from the sewage. But again, those are not generally utilized across the country. Just what you're seeing here on the slide is a pump station along Deckers Creek in Morgantown, West Virginia. This is a tributary into the Monongahela River, which is just to the left of the screen from that bridge. It's hard to see in this image, but where you see the 2 shrubs on the shoreline across the creek is there's actually 2 outfalls there, and then in the foreground where you see the cement sort of structure, and now the creek or the stone path, that's another outfall there. So just in this one area, there are 3 outfalls that could discharge CSOs into this area. And so it's just an example that pump station is used to make to try and get flows coming down through the lake or along the creek line there over to the treatment facility, which is about 2 miles away, but it helps us again get those flows to the plant. So and it related to permits, as I mentioned, our water quality standards. Sorry, I'm having a problem with my slides. If you want to go ahead, Susan, to the next slide. So water quality standards. So under the Clean Water Act, states are required to establish water quality standards that designate a body of water's designated use, such as recreation, water supply, swimming, etc., and the water quality criteria needed to meet to protect that use. So these water quality standards then become the basis for pollution limits set in the NPDES permits, and these limits can be technology-based, water quality-based, or if a numeric limit can't be set, they can be based on best management practices. So states are required to review and update as needed these standards every 3 years. The Act also requires that EPA review the state's water quality standards to make sure that they are consistent with the requirements of the Clean Water Act and implementing regulations. And then after the water qualities are established, states are required to monitor and assess the water bodies to determine the degree to which they're being met. And what we show here is another image from the Morgantown area. This is it's Lock and Dams, and this is an example of signage that is required to be posted around a CSO outfall, so that members, public, and users of the water body are aware that there's an outfall in that area. And also, you can see this, warning that generally stay away 24 to 72 hours after discharge to avoid contact with the untreated discharges. And in this area particularly, see some sign of the fish. This is a popular fishing spot. It's also just upstream of where the university's crew team docks their boats and practice on the river. So this is a popular use area, and so the water quality standards will be set to protect those uses. And now briefly just give an overview of, we're going to reference CSO controls throughout this presentation. So what are they? So CSO controls are technologies and practice implemented and used by municipalities to reduce or eliminate their CSO discharges. These controls are chosen based on site-specific conditions to account for the local issues, their conditions, needs, and resources available for the municipality to address the CSOs. It can include a variety of measures from routine inspection and maintenance to large-scale multi-year construction projects. So examples of these would be deep underground storage tunnels that are used to help store the flows before they get and reduce the impact or the stress on the treatment plants during events, and then they get later back into the system and treatment along the way. Another example is what we have shown in this slide is that a municipality can choose to separate its sewers, and so that stormwater and sewage collections are in separate pipes and reduce stress on the treatment plants. And in sewer separation, that is elimination of CSOs, since there's no longer that combined system. And this is an example where in our picture, Oswego, New York chose to separate its sewers as its means of controls. However, this is usually a very cost prohibitive option, and many cities, larger cities or areas just don't have the capabilities of separating their sewers, either for cost factors or just infrastructure limits on what they can do construction wise. So in that regard, another type of control that's been becoming more common, and we'll have an example of later in the presentation, is replacing these so-called gray infrastructure projects with more green infrastructure options to address CSO controls that are often maybe more or less expensive and have other benefits beyond just controlling the CSOs. So now I'll just kind of give an overview of what is required and included in EPA's 1994 CSO control policy. So as mentioned, so it was issued in 1994, and it was to provide guidance and establish a nationwide approach for EPA, states, and municipalities to address CSO discharges. We note that in 2000, Congress amended the Clean Water Act to incorporate the policy into the law. So now, even though it's still referred to as a policy, it has force and effect of law, and municipalities are required to comply with its terms. So, as I mentioned, I guess it's to note that while the policy sets a goal for municipalities and states to address CSOs as quickly as possible, it also recognizes that design and construction of these large CSO control projects could take a long time, and that selecting the approach and the set of controls is going to take a while, but also should include some considerations that they're cost-effective means of reducing the CSOs and improving water quality in the area. So there's a lot of trade-offs and negotiation that goes into these, and so it just has taken quite a long time in many cases. So how is it implemented? The policy established basically a three-phase approach, primarily through the NPDES permit process. And so I'm just going to give a summary of those three phases so now. So in the first phase, when they refer to them as phase 1 NPDES permits, municipalities are expected to implement what are referred to as 9 minimum controls for addressing CSOs. And these are a set of controls that were expected that municipalities could do in a relatively short time frame. They wouldn't require significant engineering studies, construction activities, or large upfront financial investments that the longer term controls would be needed. They range from a series of things, and what we have shown here is one of those is just conducting routine maintenance of the sewer and the system to make sure that obstructions or other things that might be inhibiting flows are taken care of, and thereby reduce the likelihood of CSOs occurring. Also in phase 1, municipalities are concurrently required and generally expected to develop what is called a long-term control plan that will, once implemented, achieve compliance with the Act and primarily meeting the water quality standards and protecting designated uses of the receiving stream. So under EPA's guidance, these plans generally should address 3 areas, and these are characterizing the wastewater and CSO systems, so the flows, the volumes, when they're occurring, stuff of that nature, to develop and evaluate a set of alternative controls that can be considered, and then to finally select and implement an agreed upon set of controls. These plans will include an implementation schedule as well as cost breakouts. They can be revised and amended over time, either at the initiation of the municipality or by the regulators to address any changing conditions that might be occurring. And I would note that these plans are not enforceable on their own. So in order to implement the set of controls and schedules, they need to be put into an enforceable, what the policy refers to as an appropriate enforceable mechanism. That's generally either the NPDES permit itself, or if there's particularly a longer term plan needed, then they go into maybe a consent decree or other judicially enforceable order to get the implementation going. So what we show here is information that was provided to us by EPA in terms of the number of long-term control plans that have been developed for the roughly 700 municipalities that we noted. From their information, it's about 85% of the municipalities have an approved long-term control plan in place. But I will note that this was not information that was readily available from EPA or its regions. They had to compile it at our request for the information. And I'll also say they didn't have consistent or complete information about the status of these plans. So while they may know that 85% of the municipalities have a plan in place, they can't really say with any certainty nationwide like where they are in implementing them. Have they constructed them? Have they completed the controls? Things of that nature. I also say, as I mentioned, generally they're required to have a long-term control plan, but as the table shows, about 50 municipalities have their controls implemented in some other manner. And the policy provides for an exemption, and it's basically twofold. Is if, when it was passed in '94, if municipalities had started work on their CSO controls prior to that date, either on the construction or just development of their own plan, and it was determined that they met or would be comparable to what the policy would require, then they were exempted from doing these initial planning requirements for a long-term control plan. And Susan mentioned in the outset, San Francisco is one of those cities that was exempted from initially doing an LTCP because they had started a master plan in 1971, and by the time the policy was issued in '94, they had substantially completed the controls under that plan. However, over time, the system had changed and conditions have changed since then, and EPA, in reissuing its NPDES permit in 2019, inserted a requirement that the city should develop an updated long-term control plan to better give a reflection of what the current status of the system was in terms of they've made other changes and investments since that plan. There really wasn't any consolidated documentation of all that, so it was difficult for regulators, according to EPA, to kind of understand what the status of the system was and conditions for CSOs, et cetera. San Francisco challenged that permit condition, and just on Monday, the Ninth Circuit issued its opinion, and it rejected the challenge and said the EPA had the authority to require the updated plan. So where it goes from there, who knows? But that was an ongoing issue in our review was the issues surrounding that ability to require the update and what that meant for cities in that sort of situation and otherwise, as to when their work might actually be considered completed or when they could be required to do an update. So that's just kind of an overview there of the long-term control plans and the requirements there. So then the second phase, in phase 2 permits, this is when the municipalities actually are constructing the set of controls that are selected in the long-term control plan, and then operating any of these controls and maintaining them as they're completed. Most of the municipalities are currently in this phase of still, of implementing their plans and constructing their controls. Here it shows this is an image from work in Portland, Oregon during its controls or implementation of LTCP, and their plan was to build what they call the big tunnels, and included a lot of expanded underground storage capacity. And as I mentioned before, the schedules for doing the work in the control plan and in the second phase aren't enforceable unless they're in either a permit or an order. And according to information EPA provided us, 96% of the CSO permittees have their plans in some sort of an enforceable mechanism and have dates and milestones that can be enforced. For EPA, their focus was on the largest municipalities across the country, and with them, they have about 60 municipalities that are under consent decrees with them, so it's more of a court enforced or judicially overseen process rather than the permits. And then for those that are able to complete their projects and start, they can go into what's the third phase, or called post-phase 2 permits. This is accomplished when one of the aspects of a long-term control plan is they're supposed to have a post-construction monitoring plan. And what that plan will do is, after they've constructed their controls, then the municipality follows that monitoring plan to demonstrate that their controls are working and that they're achieving compliance with water quality standards. This doesn't end their requirements, so in obligations to control their CSOs. So there's continued expectations that they will operate and maintain the CS controls as outlined in their long-term control plan, and that they'll continue monitoring, assessing changes in conditions if they're unable to meet water quality requirements or standards, and they could be required to update their set of controls to address those changes. EPA didn't have a lot of information or data on this, but there are very few municipalities that have proceeded to this post-phase 2 status. Portland is one. They completed their initial work around 2001, and they've been in an active monitoring role and kind of have a plan to go forward if conditions do change. It took them about 20 years to design and construct it. They started around 1991. So they've been finished for quite a long time, while others are still getting going, but just another sense of a range of kind of differences in status of cities with their CSOs. So with that, I'll turn it over to Heather to talk about our specific report findings and recommendations.
Thanks, Mike. And I just want to say, unfortunately, I'm based in Seattle, and the Blue Angels have decided to start practicing right now. So if you hear loud engines, I apologize. We have our Sea Fair coming up, so just unfortunate timing. But all right, so report findings. So as Mike and Susan talked about, we collected a lot of information from EPA and talking to 11 municipalities more in depth about their efforts. And I'm going to go through some of the kind of larger findings that we found, and then as well as some of the recommendations that came out of our work. So as Mike mentioned, for the 11 municipalities that we looked at, we found that most were still in various stages of implementing their long-term control plans. And we found for the 11 that we looked at more specifically, it took or will take an average of 35 years to complete their CSO efforts. This image that you're looking at right now is from Cincinnati, Ohio, and I saw in the comments that we have someone from Cincinnati on the call, so maybe they could add some more information after we finish the presentation. But this is from specifically their Lick Run project. And Cincinnati, Ohio started their CSO control efforts in 1996. And over the years, the city has considered a variety of control methods. And the image you're looking at right now is showing a combination of green infrastructure, dedicated storm sewers, and then what's called real-time controls to help reduce CSOs. It was one of several projects that replaced original plans that had a focus of building a deep underground CSO storage tank. And by shifting the focus away from that tank, the city estimated they saved about $200 million. We said at the onset that there are 3 challenges we identified in our report and go into greater depth about from the 11 municipalities. The first one that all 11 municipalities cite as a challenge, and a significant challenge I should add, is the financial affordability of implementing and developing these long-term control plans and then the subsequent CSO control efforts. There's an example right now, you're seeing Kansas City project is again a green infrastructure project that they have recently developed. For Kansas City, they started their CSO control efforts in 2007 and estimated at that time the costs were going to be between $2.4 to $3 billion for their whole planning process. They went through some revisions, and then in 2021, by changing some of their plans, again, shifting to more green infrastructure, the estimates have been revised to about $3.3 billion in total, and the city expects it to take about another 17 years to complete the work. And so as a result of these financial costs, again, and those costs are attributed to many factors that we outline in the report, but we found that most of the municipalities we spoke with are in the process of revising their plans to adjust their timeframes, the types of projects and controls chosen, and hopefully impacting the costs. And in general, this is leading to extensions of the amount of time that the cities are estimating is going to take to implement these controls. Our second key challenge, and Mike outlined kind of what water quality standards are and how that impacts CSOs and controlling CSOs. But we found the second challenge cited by some of the municipalities we spoke with is meeting requirements based on state water quality standards while they are both implementing their plans and then as they're getting towards the completion of those plans, going towards the end of phase 2 into phase 3. An example that we learned a lot about was Detroit. And again, I saw in the comment box, we have a few folks from that area, including Aaron, so maybe they can talk about it later. But Detroit is currently capturing and treating over 75% of the municipality's CSO discharges. And this is after a 40-year effort of planning and funding large infrastructure projects. However, there's a state law that prohibits the discharge of any untreated or partially treated sewage into the waters of the state. And so the municipality is currently developing and revising its long-term plan to look at that last remaining percentage of how to do it. But in talking to officials from both the state and the city, there's a lot of questioning and discussion happening whether the money that could be spent in that last remaining percentage is worthwhile, or if they should shift to other water quality improvement efforts. Flood mitigation is a big issue in that area right now. And so the city and officials we talked to are trying to balance kind of the needs of both addressing CSOs and other issues as well. And then our third key challenge we heard from some of the municipalities is adapting to climate change. And for example, San Francisco had done an evaluation of how climate change would affect its CSO controls that were already in place. And as part of its response, the city decided, because of the potential impacts of sea level rise on its CSO outfalls, it ended up installing backflow prevention structures on those that it found to be most vulnerable. We also heard that from some of the municipalities that the modeling and the data that's available for them to use in revising the plans is outdated. For example, some cited that the models and information they're using is collected from the 1970s and doesn't reflect kind of the last 10 plus years of more severe and frequent storms that are happening in different parts of the country. And so they did note that there needs to be better modeling tools available and ways to assess the risks associated with climate change. So again, we did collect all this information. We talked to a lot of people. We did this work during COVID or the peak COVID time, so we weren't able to travel as much, although Mike was able to get to Detroit and Morgantown for us to do some on the ground work. But what we do at GAO, and Susan mentioned this earlier, is we collect all this information and develop recommendations for the federal entity that is under the review. So in this case, it's EPA, on how they can improve their operations and performance in relation to the topic that we're looking at. And what I wanted to say is, we definitely recognize in the report and through our work that EPA has been working and trying to adjust CSOs for decades. But as Mike talked about earlier, the agency really still cannot report or discuss the status of CSOs nationwide currently. So as such, we ended up developing 3 recommendations for EPA. Our first 2 recommendations focus on EPA's needs for monitoring and tracking and doing this through something we call performance measures. Again, we found in our report and our work that EPA could access high-level data on the number of long-term control plans and enforceable mechanisms around the country. Although again, as Mike said, we had to request that data and EPA had to compile it. It wasn't publicly available. And also the agency was not able to provide information, again, nationwide, on when long-term control plans are going to be completed, the costs associated with them, and also what water quality benefits either have resulted or are expected to result from those efforts. So again, our first recommendations focus on how EPA could improve its understanding of the status nationwide of these plans and improvements to water quality. GAO has done a body of work on the benefits of federal agencies using performance metrics, both measures and goals, as a best management practice, and we call it a leading practice, something that we often recommend to multiple federal agencies, not just EPA. And we find that with consistent tracking and reporting, EPA will be better positioned to identify ways to both improve long control plans and its programs, and potentially guidance also associated with how you can develop those long-term control plans. I also want to note with this slide that EPA right now does have an electronic database that contains information about the state NIPD's permits and monitoring information. And that is information that's inputted by the EPA regions, authorized states, and the individual permittees. But in 2015, EPA did issue something called the NIPD's electronic reporting rule, which requires most permitted facilities and authorized states to submit additional certain data related to their permittees and the programs such as the CSO programs. And municipalities are going to be required to start entering that data electronically in 2025 in relation to their CSO discharges. So we recognize that EPA is going to be coming into a wealth of data in a few years, but in the meantime, we still think EPA can work to collect that data and get that information publicly available. Which leads us to our third recommendation, which is on how EPA shares the information and gets that data available to stakeholders across the country. We came about this recommendation because we learned and saw that the public, municipalities, Congress, and others do not have current updated information on CSO efforts nationwide, but definitely could benefit from this knowledge. And we specifically recommended that EPA find a way to report on the progress of CSO projects nationwide, and including on the progress that's been made on these plans, and also on costs and estimated timeframes. In the past, EPA has published reports on CSOs nationwide, and they've done regional studies as well. I think we recognize that people get their information differently nowadays, so we didn't prescribe how EPA needs to make this information available, whether it be a web page or some kind of formalized report, but that they get the information out there somehow. So we're going to now shift to just the last bit of our presentation is on what you all can do in relation to kind of helping us and helping EPA and CSO controls. I'm going to turn it back to Mike, and he's going to walk through some of these websites and information.
Great, thanks, Heather. So our first sort of recommended step you can do kind of builds off of the recommendations that Heather just outlined in terms of just becoming familiar with the information available on the status of CSO control efforts nationwide. It had been since 2004 was the last nationwide report EPA had issued that sort of gave a status update. So there's been a lot of changes in that time. And so what they're going to do, or what you can do is look at this, monitor their sites and see the information on the status. So what we've provided here are links to 2 of their locations that they plan to put this information. The first is on EPA's ECHO website, which has a series of, it's connected to the national database and has a series of dashboards and other types of information that you can get for CSOs, or will be included in that capability in the near future. They'll have information on inspections, violations, and enforcement actions, among other data. The other place they plan to put more information is on their dedicated CSO website, and that's the link we have there. That's currently, again, being updated based on some of the things we recommended. They do have a progress tab in there that will then link to case studies and/or data on success. So that's just another place that hopefully will have the ability that you can search and find specifics as well as nationwide examples. And the third thing is for our report page, you can see we monitor the status of implementation of the recommendations, and so that would just be a place to check in and see where they're at in doing the things we recommended and that they agree to do. So you can see a status of that on our on that webpage link. The second thing you can do, or among others, right, is to request and review copies of long-term control plans, including the post-construction monitoring plans. As I mentioned earlier, there's not an existing clearinghouse or database of these plans. And in some cases, they can be very hard to find. Some municipalities, especially those that are under consent decrees, will have a dedicated page and set up updates and progress on the projects they're doing and information that you can get readily, while others don't and can be very hard to find. So it's a good starting point just to get those and be familiar with it. And even the other important reason to do that is for those that are planning to do revisions and updates to their plans, the policy requires a public participation process in that. And so that's another thing where you can get directly involved. And so keep informed and monitor those when their opportunities exist to participate in the development of them, rather than just on the back end and looking at how they're being implemented. And so with that, the other is to engage with the local, state, and EPA officials in your areas about CSO issues. Where they have limited resources and can't be everywhere all the time, right? And many of us are probably, being outdoors and near these places or near these outfalls, maybe not knowingly, but they're out there. And so, what you see here, they may not know. So being engaged with them both to help provide information to them, but also, hey, if you see that these are the plans and we're not seeing this going on. And so it's just a way to engage in the process of CSO implementation and getting your concerns expressed. So again, it's probably many things you're doing in other areas, but again, with CSOs particularly, these are just some ideas of how you can get started. So I'll turn it back over to Susan, Heather, or our moderators, and take questions.
Great, thank you, Heather, Michael, and Susan. That was very, very informative. So we appreciate you all taking the time to share that information with us, and looking forward to reading the report. Yeah, so we are going to take a couple of minutes for question and answer. We have a couple in the chat right now, but definitely feel free to plug your questions in the chat, or if you do want to raise your hand and you can ask the question and come off mute. But so the first question goes back to that map that we saw in the beginning of the presentation. Why are there so many concentrated CSOs in the Great Lakes region compared to others? Is there a clear reason for that?
Mike or Heather, do you want to address that?
Sure, I'll take it. Primarily just in the abilities of, when these were the areas that were first settled and developed in the country. And so, back, some of these systems were started over 100 years ago. And so there really wasn't a lot of options for how to deal with sewage and wastewater at that time. So the easiest way was just, in the initial periods, it was just, these are also places where there's, they're not as dry, you get a lot of rainfall, so the flows work in the system better. But basically, they were just the means of getting the sewage away from the population areas. And there weren't treatment plants, there weren't other things. But so as the cities grew and over time, they just sort of built off these existing systems, built the plants and diverted flows there, but then the outfalls remained as a vestige. More of the other areas, out west and developed later, they have separate sewer systems. So they didn't do the combined approach. They had the ability to utilize newer technology and resources. And so that's one of the primary reasons for the regional disparity or difference.
So the next question I think was pretty much already answered, but just curious how to find individual long-term control plans. And that sounds like there isn't really a central database, but it's more sort of requesting it through, is it your municipality or through the EPA?
Primarily through your municipality would be the best first place to start and a starting point. They'll have a page dedicated to it, or it'll be linked to CSOs or an issue in that area. They've probably gotten complaints about basement flooding or other things, right? So they should be doing something about it, and so that's a place to start. And as I mentioned, those that are under a consent decree, they definitely should have it on their web pages and monitoring implementation of that. As an alternative, some states, I know Ohio and Pennsylvania, they have their own state level database of CSOs. Some of them have links to the documents. In going through them, they may not always be active or current. But so your state level environmental agency might have it. But again, as we talked to pretty much municipalities and EPA regions across the map that you see, or that I'm seeing, and they don't necessarily have that readily available. But it might take some hoops to get through, but those are kind of your best places to start to get them.
Yeah, I just want to add to that with, one of the cities we looked at was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and it's had a change in leadership and around the utility. So it is important to kind of see if you can find the most relevant, and surprisingly, sometimes you might find an LTCP that's from the 2015 or so. That might be the most recent one. It might not. Sometimes might seem surprised that they seem a little bit dated, but they may be under that revision process. So finding the right entity that's kind of shepherding that through in that municipality, and then trying to find a timeline, and so you can know which is the most current document.
Great, thanks. So the next question in the chat, long-term control plans can use various outcome targets like 85% capture or 4 overflows per year or actual water quality results, but it seems these are not necessarily equivalent targets. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure, I can take that. So yeah, so that's alluding to we didn't want to get too in the details of the policy, but there are kind of two approaches that municipalities can take in developing their plans and setting the level of controls. What you mentioned there in terms of the 85% and the limits on the number of overflows is what's called the presumption approach. And that is actually those. So yeah, so in that scenario, you kind of develop models on the flows and we use those as the target levels. And it touches on the slide we showed about ability to meet and achieve water quality standards. Nashville is a city that we went to that's having that trouble, that their plans and their controls are nearing meeting that criteria of the percent control, but that is not necessarily tied to what level is needed to achieve water quality standards. So some of these places that relied on that approach, and they might be meeting those targets, yet, and have implemented their controls that we talked about, millions of dollars investments, are finding that may not be enough to meet the water quality standards. So the alternative approach, or what would have been a way to mitigate that result in the back end, is what they call the demonstration approach. And there, rather than developing your controls to meet these somewhat arbitrary levels, right, of 85% or not, you upfront, and these are areas where there's maybe better information known about their discharges and the contributing pollutants to the receiving stream. And in those cases where you can really identify what the contribution of CSOs are to water quality impacts in that region, in that water body, then you can set the control specifically to what's needed to achieve the use of the water quality. Again, so that's just sort of the difference in how they're approached. Hope that answers the question. But yeah, we kind of doing those are key considerations to be made during the long-term control process and agreeing on what to do. And as again, sort of alluded to, now that most of those are getting to the phase where they actually have to demonstrate that. For either scenario, that's what you have to do, is meet the water quality standards. So that's a continuing area that's been recognized. And what we didn't mention to do, but EPA has recognized this, so they are working with states to try to develop some guidance and develop some tools to help recognize that kind of challenge and how to proceed to meeting those standards with the controls they're developing.
I'll just add that what Mike's getting at is that idea that the post-construction monitoring is supposed to demonstrate that the controls are meeting Clean Water Act requirements, including the permit requirements. And so if it's shown that it's not being done, then controls do have to be amended, added, changed, so that the Clean Water Act has to be met. And so this has been a long-term process of kind of narrow, starting large and trying to hit the bullseye, narrowing down and trying to hit the bullseye. And now that these municipalities are getting closer to completing their construction, they're starting to see how much they're actually able to control the discharges and have water quality improvements. It's just why we made our recommendation that they should be looking at how water quality is being improved if they want to see how these things are working. So, and it is a very long-term process, as both Heather and Mike have mentioned. And so it's gradually getting to the point where they're demonstrating this, either approach they took, presumptive or demonstrative. And now that we're actually getting to the monitoring, seeing what water quality improvements have been made. So, and EPA is aware of it and working with cities as they start to realize that they might have to do more. And that has been an issue. That's the litigation that San Francisco is going through. And that Nashville is facing, that Mike mentioned. Anyway, it's very interesting policy, and you all can be involved in it. It's all very local.
Yeah, thank you. The next question we have, given your perspective, do you see a conflict between a GSI long-term control plan versus a gray infrastructure approach? Do you see conflicts between GSI as an approach versus the policy adopted as law in 2000?
I'll take a first stab at this because we actually have done some work on green infrastructure, and we looked at, in fact, all of the consent decrees for CSOs because it was a method that EPA was including in updates to its orders, consent decrees, that sort of thing, on combined sewer overflow discharges, to work with cities to add green infrastructure to their agreements in order to help control their costs. And both Heather and Mike have mentioned this. So we actually have a report I can drop into the chat, but it's a little older than this one, but it was definitely a consideration in the cost and feasibility of some of these plans that EPA was negotiating with the larger municipalities on how to control costs and get these things done. So I don't know that it's directly conflicting. Green infrastructure is still being determined to how much it can control flows, the kind of engineering assumptions that go into it. The CSO, the gray infrastructure, is more certain. Engineers tend to try to be certain about these things because we're dealing with floodwaters often, stormwater and floodwaters. So I think that what we've seen is gradual inclusion, but definitely an acceptance of green infrastructure. Maybe Heather and Mike want to add some more.
I would just say quickly, and then Heather can chime in. I don't think that there's a tension necessarily, because the goal and the objective of whatever controls that they set and whatever combination of the controls are, most of these are, have combinations of green infrastructure along with either separation, like we mentioned, increasing the capacity of the plants. But at the end, they still have to meet the water quality standards. So whatever package and combination they do, it has to meet that goal. And we talked directly to EPA officials about sort of green infrastructure and what, kind of getting at the point if there's any tension, or does that mean less? And, at least to us and in their practice, it says, it has to be as effective as whatever alternative control it's replacing. So it doesn't get a lower expectation of control or compliance. It still needs to meet the same expectation and perform as well. So, but in the cities we met with, the example from Cincinnati and initial results from Kansas City, they are showing success at a lower cost and significant. But some places, such as Morgantown here, it's not an option because of the soils or other conditions. So that also contributes to how much it can be utilized or implemented in a specific area.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add to this, and I think both Mike and Susan raised good points, is, and one thing we, again, just for interest of time, we didn't talk about, but is the kind of the revisions to these plans. That itself is a cost for these communities to absorb and to plan for. And so if you're shifting away from green infrastructure from gray to more green, we heard from some municipalities that just that revision process itself, they have to hire engineers. They might have folks that are on staff, but especially some of the smaller communities we spoke with, it's just not an option financially for them to kind of say, we've made a commitment to this one path of gray infrastructure. And while green infrastructure might be possible or feasible, we'd have to hire consultants, more engineers, and to kind of restart that process, or revisit that process, I should say. So it does become more of a kind of site-specific or locality by locality decision. We mentioned and highlighted Kansas City, Harrisburg, some of these larger places that have a little bit more resources to put towards it. And I think I'm just seeing Sally's question in the chat. I think it's still under debate. I think it's still being looked at, but as Mike mentioned, they have to meet the Clean Water Act requirements, and the cities are doing monitoring and tracking, and in some places it does seem to show a benefit.
I cannot type while I'm in Zoom for some reason. The report that I was referring to is GAO 17-750. You can just search that on our website. That's our green infrastructure report that we did a little while ago. I don't know that diverting the money is worsening the problem. I think that it helps to absorb the stormwater, and that's what they're trying to manage. But it is a newer technology that hasn't been proven in long term about how it can help control stormwater flows. I think that's what everybody's trying to work on, trying to understand.
Yeah, thank you all so much for these really insightful answers and great questions, everyone. And I'm going to now pass it over to Erin to wrap us all up.
Yeah, thank you all so much. And sorry, we just have about a minute left. So I just want to say thank you everyone for joining us today. We always appreciate your input on how these learning sessions are for you. So we do appreciate when you get a chance to fill out a very short survey evaluation, which I just put in the chat. We will be sending out this recording along with the links that were shared, along with some other relevant resources to y'all on CSOs following the call. So keep an eye out for that. And yeah, thank you again so much to our speakers. April, do you have any last words you'd like to share?
Yeah, I just want to say thank you again so much to Heather, Susan, and Mike for taking the time to prepare the presentation and be here today to share the important work that you're doing. So thank you for being here, and thank you to all of you for the work that you're doing in your communities and in your watersheds. It was great to be here with you today, and just a lot of appreciation to all of you, and to Colleen and Aaron, the co-facilitators on today's call. So I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and we will hope to see you all again soon. Thanks, everybody.